Hello.
Hello.
So you may notice something new. Dave has new glasses.
It's really weird.
It's really weird to come out.
Weird
So
looking at
send him
myself,
some love
especially.
about his new nerdy look.
I feel like my eyes are so tiny now.
They don't look tiny.
Oh, can you see I have eyes?
Yes, we can see you have eyes. You look wonderful. I'm like looming in the frame here. Anyway.
You can lower your chair.
Oh, that's right. I always forget.
You always forget. There you go.
Anyway, so we're going to discuss propositions 22 and 23. So 22 is the one about Uber. So the gig workers benefits, as it's called. And Prop 23 is kidney dialysis clinic rules part 2. If you were around for the 2018, I think it was 2018 election, kidney dialysis was on the ballot then as well. Not dialysis, but clinic rules too. So anyway, Prop 22.
Gotcha. So Prop 22 is basically in response to stuff that the government has already passed. You've probably seen it if you're paying attention at all, where they changed how, they've been changing a lot of how sort of gig and not at-will employees, but anyone who has sort of a temporary gig has to be treated by their employers. And they specifically hit Uber and Lyft and all the rideshare, DoorDash, all those earlier this year, saying all of your employees have to be employees. They can't be sort of this gig thing anymore. And as you can imagine, those companies didn't like that, so they came up with Prop 22 and put it on the ballot. Basically, what it does is it gives more benefits to drivers than what they had under the previous law without making them actual employees, which is primarily for things like health benefits and stuff like that. They do gain certain benefits. There's an earning minimum that is set at 120% of the local minimum wage, health insurance stipend, pay for costs when a driver gets hurt on the job, arrest policy, as well as some other requirements, criminalizing impersonation of drivers, things like that. So all good stuff in comparison to what it was before, but it doesn't make them full employees, and so they don't get the same full benefits and some of that other stuff. Obviously, this was put on the ballot by the companies themselves, but a lot of drivers are very split on this issue as well, with a lot of them wanting that employment status, with a bunch more wanting them to remain independent. I am in favor of Prop 22. Again, where it feels a little weird, sort of voting along the lines of the corporation when you know they sort of put it on here for you to like say yes to and sort of get them out of the trouble they're in with the government right now. But the thing is, I just don't like how the gig economy is treated in California. I'll give you, there's just some really weird rules, and I'll give you an example. So there's a podcast I used to listen to. I don't much anymore because I don't drive as much. Padres podcast, and one of the two hosts was hired to basically be the podcast expert for this sports sort of network, right? They have all these sites for the individual teams, and so he was hired to be the podcast guy and advertise their podcast, make their podcast network good. And so he couldn't continue on with this independent podcast that he was doing. He had to be pulled off, and so the other guy got some guests, and so they eventually figured it out where they became one of the official podcasts for the podcast network this guy was setting up at this company. And that went great for about half a year, and then California set in laws that restricted how the gig economy worked, and if they did more than 30 gigs for the same company in a year, they had to be hired full-time by the company or something like that. So they came out and they're like, hey, so we can't do a podcast every week anymore, because we can't hit that 30 number. So it's really awkward. We have to be really careful about how we do this early in the year, because what if something happens later in the year? What if the Padres make the playoffs and we want to have all these actual podcasts about important stuff? And so that's just one example of how it restricts the ability of these people who are doing this as a side gig, right? Mm-hmm. The one guy, like I said, has his full-time job running the podcast network for this company, and the other one has gigs as he's basically the interesting thing is he has been hired at different points as a sports broadcaster, but his point in his career was primarily doing gigs. He would fill in a job here, fill in a job there, whatever, and it was going well, but obviously his entire way of living was being affected by this. So I just like people having the option to do that. And I realize that this law doesn't fix all of those things, but if the one that we can actually vote on, we can make sure that that is still an option for those people, then I'd like to keep it that way. I like there being options for people who are, for example, a lot of online writing is this way, where it's a gig thing where you do this many writing things and you get, a stipend or whatever, and that's a good way to get your feet wet. A lot of people argue, well, they should be paid full-time right away, and it just doesn't work that way, because the companies are just it's going to create fewer opportunities for people. Like, one person's going to get hired and they're going to get to write a bunch, and then the other people are just kind of SOL. They don't have an option for that. And I don't know. Part of me wonders if something like this really should be a full-time job. People who are using it for that. Not that I think that they should drive less, but there needs to be an awareness of this is what this job is, right? I want this to be available for an elderly retired person who had to retire a bit early due to disability, doesn't have quite enough money. Hey, you can get a gig job, right? You don't have to work full time anymore, but you can do 20 hours a week and just, it's at your own schedule. If you need to pick up your grandkids or something, the options are there for you. I think the ability to have these is a good thing. And right now in California, it feels like if we pass this, this is it. There are fewer and fewer of those opportunities in California specifically, and I think having this available is a good thing. And that's to say nothing of all the, a lot of this is fear mongering probably, but there's probably some reality to it where these companies are threatening to pull out of California, or they're saying the cost of this is gonna go way up. And let's be real, we're all using DoorDash a lot, for example, nowadays, specifically right now. And having the rideshare system available is really nice. There was a very real dispute, I think it was Uber got into with the Ontario airport. It was this year, last year, where they started charging more. Basically, Ontario Airport wanted a bigger cut. I don't know how they negotiate this. For when Uber picks up there, they wanted the same cuts that the LA and Orange County airports were getting. And they're like, well, we're going to set it here. And Uber was like, okay, our drivers are not servicing your airport anymore. And so it was lift or bust at the Ontario airport. I don't actually know what the status of that is for a while because I haven't traveled recently. But just to give you an example, they have come through on these threats at least once in the past where it just doesn't make business sense for them. So all right, we'll just make our money elsewhere. See ya. So anyway, that's why I'm voting yes on it.
Yeah, this one was interesting because like you were saying, when you see the corporation slap its stamp on it. And
giant fist of money to get something on the ballot,
That always, makes me a little bit, I don't know about that, but one point that you made was something that had been running around in my head too, should gig work be a full-time benefit working for, the stereotypical 8 to 5 that you think of? And I don't know, and I don't want to say that people can't do gig work, be an Uber driver, and make that their first full-time job or primary full-time job. I don't know. I don't think that's what it was designed for. It was designed to be a flexible opportunity that was supposed to be able to help out people who needed work, whether it was Dave was saying, a retiree who just wants to make some money or do something with flexibility, or someone who's in between jobs, or someone who has a different gig kind of job where they're a musician or a stand-up comic or something along those lines where this is part of that hustle. It's a different hustle, but it gives them more flexibility. And so I know some of the threats were we'll have to cut tons of openings, we'll have to make everything very corporate, people will be assigned shifts potentially, as opposed to having flexible hours. It'd be more like
if you have
a cab company.
Yeah, if you have to hire people for that many hours, why would you hire the same number of people? Because so many of those people are working fewer hours, so you'll have your 40-hour workers, and that'll be it. And it's just, that's okay, but it's not,
So this does this is sort of a compromise from the big corporations with the law. The law itself is kind of interesting too. Is AB 5, I think it's called, Assembly Bill 5, and it was effective this January, but it also exempts a lot of other gig workers. There's certain restrictions or certain exemptions allowed for like hairstylists and barbers. I believe that if they have a booth rental, they're exempt from this. Certain doctors that are independent contractors, real estate agents, accountants. So I think something mentioned like even strippers, like there's, I don't think they have an exemption, but like they could be affected by stuff like this as well. So the more like philosophical concept of like, should this be a full-time job or whatever, I don't know, but I also wish that there is a little more in the compromise, specifically the non-engaged time. So they'll receive benefits for their engaged hours, which means driving with a body in the car, so that's engaged time. But when they're waiting in between rides, when they're waiting,
they get it for driving to the person before they pick them up.
I don't know.
I think language, they do, but I'm not 100% sure. They seem to say drive time, and specify like not when you're waiting. Let's see if it's.
Yeah, I think it's when you're not waiting between jobs. So I would hope that would include when you're driving to the person to go pick them up, but I don't know. But the waiting time, it reminded me of when I worked at a tutoring center, and it was basically gig work. Like you could make a full-time paycheck ostensibly, but rarely did anyone actually do that. But it was flexible. You would go in, you'd have clients, and then if a client canceled or if you just didn't have someone in between students, the company did have an option for you to do what was called like prep work, where you would it could be anything. It could be preparing curriculum, anything from that to like cleaning the desks. It was just sort of random work, and you would be paid a smaller portion of what you would be paid for actual tutoring. So I would have liked to see something like that available, not like that an Uber driver can like go clean something or whatever, during that time, but some kind of like, small pay or whatever during those waiting times. But I guess that might get complicated too, because then you're kind of making like a shift work in that scenario. So I don't know. But my vote is going to be a yes as well.
Yeah. I just think it seems like the very existence of the gig economy is something that they're not sure, even beyond whether you think this driving you should be able to have a like full-time job out of, or whether it should be part of the gig economy.
Right.
I think there is very much a push from the left primarily of, should the gig economy even exist? Should we allow the gig economy to exist, or should everyone have to be an employee because that's good for the employee? We want them to get all the benefits. Yeah, more money for them, less control for the corporation, which sounds good, but I think that there are a lot of people who like the gig economy. And when you read like the arguments for and against, a lot of them on both sides are the drivers. Like both sides want to convince you this is what's best for the drivers.
Yeah,
which makes me split. This and the next one make me feel weird, because I'm like dictating how this specific class of people get to live their lives, and I'm not part of it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, so it's very strange. But there are a lot of drivers who don't want this to change because they like, even if somehow they keep the same number of employees under the new rules, they're not going to have the same freedom that they had before. There's going to be shifts, there's going to be hours, because that's how it's going to have to be run. And that is going to increase overhead for the company as well. Like, not only is it going to mean paying them more and costs will go up for that, but having to organize that and having shift managers and all that fun stuff is like, that's not going to be cheap. So it is definitely increasing the cost. But yeah, I do believe the gig economy should be an option. And so I don't believe that it is inherently a negative thing that needs to be fought against, I guess. So
we had some thoughts on this one.
Yeah.
Welcome to 15 minutes later on Prop 22. And it's funny because I was telling Dave, like, as we were preparing for these, I was like, man, Prop 22, like, I see that one all over the place, like on my Instagram feeds, and I see like posters on the street and stuff. And so, but for both, yes and no. And it doesn't really say anything on the poster. It's just like, yes, with like a car on fire or something. Like,
what? Why is it on fire?
I don't know. But it's a fiery one.
Wow.
For sure. So,
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to Proposition 23. So Proposition 23 deals with kidney dialysis clinics and basically adding some more rules or restrictions. This may sound familiar because I think it was about a couple of years ago there was another kidney dialysis proposition on the ballot, which was voted down by Californians. So this is kind of round two, and I believe this was put on by unionizing corporations,
Basically,
right?
dialysis workers and
Yes.
yeah.
So what this would do, it would say that there must be a full-time board-certified physician present during all hours, all working hours of the clinic, and the clinic must report infection data to the state. Currently, most clinics are reporting infection data to federal government, so they are already reporting data. That's a federal law. To the feds, though, not to the state. And it would prohibit insurance discrimination. So clinics couldn't turn down certain insurance type. I think that's what that means. And they must get approval from the state before a clinic can close. So if a clinic, and I think this argument is kind of, should healthcare be a business versus how much should the government be involved in healthcare and protecting people in healthcare? So that's kind of part of the philosophical argument within this one, because kidney dialysis clinics are for-profit businesses. They're usually most of them. They're usually privately run, and so right now they sort of dictate what happens what kind of insurance they'll accept, when their hours are, and if they need to close if they're not making enough money to keep it open. And so a couple of the clinics that I read about, they do already have a board certified physician on staff at all times, but they're not required to be like on doctor duty the whole time. They're the medical director of the clinic, so they would be present. So if there was an emergency, they I would hope kick into gear and do their doctor thing, but they're primarily there, at least partly there, for the director duties, and then but they are a board certified physician. So basically this law would put a covering over all in the state and would say that there must be a physician present and full-time as a physician, not as partly a director, partly this or that. They're just there to be a doctor. And the rationale for that is if there's an emergency or if there's some kind of medical situation, there's the doctor. There she is to do what's got to be done. So a yes on this would mean yes to all those requirements, and a no would mean just stay as it is. So this one is tricky too, because I've also seen nurses and healthcare workers split on this, kind of like drivers are split on 22. I've seen a split amongst healthcare workers also on this one. My vote right now is a no. Yeah.
You don't say why or anything like that?
I mean, I really feel unqualified for this one,
Yeah.
honestly. But based on, the bit of research that I've done, I'm hesitant to put more state control over these businesses. I'm not a huge fan of health as a business, but it is. And I don't know, man. Something isn't sitting well with me about this one. Especially since the first one was already overturned. I'm kind of like, what are we doing with this one? So
yeah.
I don't know. My current vote is no.
This isn't the first one where there's a big organization. This is not a corporation. It's basically the opposite of that, where it's unions who are putting this thing on there, trying to push their agenda. And that doesn't mean we should vote no on it, because I've voted yes on a couple of those. Both 19 and 22 actually were that. So I guess this is going to make me seem a little anti-labor union since I voted for the ones the corporations put on here, but I am going to vote no on this one that a labor union put on here. I just don't quite get this one. I get the idea is to make it safer, But I don't even see how like the union is benefiting necessarily. Like, it doesn't say that like nurses are going to get more hours. It seems almost like a spiteful, like, we don't want you to make money, so we're going to put all these I don't see how this helps the workers at the dialysis clinic necessarily.
Yeah.
And I was on the fence about this one too, because I could see some of the benefits, but the more I think about it, it's like they talk about how dangerous it is. Like, they could have put some numbers in here about like how many accidents happen at these clinics that a doctor could have done something about, and that nurses just weren't enough for. And there's really nothing like that in here. I think this does actually like increase the number of nurses that have to be active or on staff, which might be what the union is going for. They're just having more nurses there, but I just don't. There's a lot of stuff in here that's weird. Like, they have to apply to the state before they close or reduce services, so the state can just say no, and they just have to keep running at a loss. Like, that seems not good. Like, that you're not. Part of the thing with capitalism, the philosophy of capitalism is you're encouraged to do the best job possible because you will be rewarded with money. Once you stop being rewarded with money, once you're having to run this place at a loss, what is your motivation as a for-profit company for maintaining things? Like, your motivation is now gone. And there are actually a couple things in here I like. I like them not being able to discriminate based on insurance type. And that's because they negotiate basically different payment levels with like private insurance companies versus like the state Medi-Cal and stuff like that, or like group payment stuff. And I like that. I think health insurance is one of those things. Before we start talking about state healthcare, I'd actually like to start fixing like insurance and in-network, out-of-network BS, and where you can get hit by a car, and if you happen to get taken to an out-of-network hospital, oops, you're SOL, and you're gonna have to pay all this money because you were unconscious or something like that. It's just, oh gosh, that is so predatory and garbage. Anyway, so I like the insurance stuff in here, and that's about it. I'm not convinced that this will make a substantive difference in the level of care that people are getting. Because especially if you have to pay more for, I guess they have to go through the inspections, but if you're going to have to pay so much more for your staffing, what's going to happen to the facilities, what's going to happen to the equipment, I don't know, man. I don't doubt for a second that these people are making way more money than they should for something that people have to get to like save their lives, but something about this feels a little messy to me.
Yeah, and then you were talking too about like the state has to approve if a clinic is going to close.
Like, what are they basing that off of?
I don't feel like that's just gonna. They're gonna be forced to stay open longer at a loss while waiting for the state to make a decision, because I don't think the state is gonna be like, oh, let me get right on that, or oh, our system is so efficient that we can definitely get you in.
Oh yeah.
That's just how it is, and the
Evan
state is a
Newsom
big
was talking
government.
about how terrible their system is, and how we inherited
was?
this. You didn't hear about this? Oh, there was
No.
this thing with like the COVID data where like it got wrong for like a couple weeks, and it came out, our system is from like the 80s and it's so old. And I was like,
Hey, I'm from the
last
80s.
I checked, you're the governor and you could like, fix that before this happened. But I mean, I guess the system from the 80s or whatever is fine. Like, that's such a government thing. Oh, I inherited this stuff. Well, I mean, you could have done something, that old system that you inherited or
If
whatever.
it was a good system, however, he wouldn't have inherited it. Look what I did.
I
know. And that's not a slam against Newsom. That is just literally
politicians,
politicians.
It's politicians.
Exactly. So, anyway, we're voting no on both of those. No, we're voting
yes on 22.
Oh, my
no
bad.
on
We're
23.
voting yes on 22. No on 23.
Great.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Keep commenting. I appreciate a couple of you have like live tweeted directly to me, but have live texted while watching these and just talking about. I really love the discussion, so thank you so much for that. We appreciate you, we love you, and we'll be back with the last video for propositions 24 and 25.
Mm-hmm.
All right, stay tuned, you guys. Take care.